Let me introduce, my name's Dave McAvoy. I'm the chair or interim chair of the Department of Econ. And we're happy today to have our own Dr. Dennis Guignet speak to us about the economics of environmental policy. Denny, he graduated his PhD from the University of Maryland, I think in 2011, and worked for 7 years or so at the Environmental Protection Agency as an economist. And we got him luckily in 2018. He really just hit the ground running here at AppState, and a tremendous kind of help to our department in many ways. Great teacher, but also a phenomenal researcher in this area of environmental policy. So let's give him the floor here.
All right, thanks, Dave. So y'all can see the title slide there. Great. I'm gonna minimize my view window just so I can see my notes. But feel free to interrupt me at any point. Ask questions or ask me to clarify or elaborate on anything. That's perfectly fine. I have enough material to cover probably about 40 minutes or so. So there's plenty of time to jump in and ask questions. And it's supposed to be useful for you all. So that's my goal here. But thanks for coming out to hear me share some of my experience working as an economist in a professional environment. And I'm hoping to share some of that experience, but also to kind of organize things in a way where, in sharing my experience, I can also highlight potential career and educational paths for folks interested in environmental policy or interested in economic analysis. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about draws specifically on examples from the Environmental Protection Agency, but I think a lot of it could apply to federal government and policies more generally, and also for the state governments as well. The title, Harnessing Economics to Better Environmental Policy and Where You Might Fit, I was really trying to make it more career-oriented to highlight those potential paths. So it wasn't too long ago when I was kind of in some of your shoes, especially if you all are pursuing your bachelor's degree right now. 15 years ago or so, I was an undergrad at Penn State. I was interested in preserving the environment. I wasn't really good at chemistry, so I didn't really want to do kind of the natural sciences, but I also thought the best way for me to kind of figure out how to better our environment was by studying the interaction between humans and the environment. How do humans respond to changes in the environment? How does human behavior affect the environment? And so that's what really drew me to the field of economics. That said, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I was pursuing a bachelor's in environmental and renewable resource economics, but what the heck do you do with a major like that, right? I knew I wanted to do environmental policy work, but I also saw opportunities to go on for a master's degree and possibly a PhD, and actually get a university to help support me in doing that. So I ended up, pursuing that path. I went to the University of Maryland to pursue a master's degree in economics. I chose Maryland because it was near DC, and I knew I wanted to do environmental policy. But also an attractive feature of their program was it allowed you to seamlessly transition from the master's program into the PhD program if you did well that first year or two. And so that was really an attractive feature. Because and an ongoing theme from this talk is, if you're at all interested in pursuing graduate school, I think, the more education you get, the more doors it leaves open for you. So that's kind of going to be an ongoing theme throughout this. But so I ended up getting my PhD from Maryland, as Dave said, and then I was an economist for 7 years at the Environmental Protection Agency. There, about half of my time was reviewing and giving suggestions to improve benefit cost analyses, which help inform the regulatory development process. And the other half of the time I was doing original research to provide estimates to inform the next generation of benefit cost analyses for the regulations we're pursuing in the future. So that's kind of my background. And today I'm just going to be discussing the process of how environmental policy is introduced, how it's developed, and how it's implemented. And like I was saying, I hopefully hope to highlight how people like you with business or economic backgrounds, public policy backgrounds can help inform that process and where you might fit in that process. So that's kind of my spiel. And of course, all of this is my own kind of personal insights. And, I encourage you to talk to other faculty members, talk to other potential employers, gather as much information you can to see what a potentially useful career for you might be or what path you might want to take. All right. So where can an environmental economist work? I characterize myself as an environmental economist. Those of you who don't know the term environmental economist, it's just an economist that uses economics and applies it to the theory and the empirical techniques to examine environmental issues. So we ask questions like, what market forces lead to suboptimal environmental outcomes? How do we correct for those market failures? What might be the socially efficient or sustainable amount of pollution? Right? Sometimes we butt head with the environmentalists because, a hardcore environmentalist will say, well, we should have no pollution. We should use none of our exhaustible resources, right? But economists kind of act as, I'm a little biased because I am an economist, but we kind of act as a quote, rational voice saying, well, we can't say no pollution, right? Because then we have to turn off all the lights. We can't do anything that's extremely costly. There's an efficient amount of pollution. You just have to look at those trade-offs. So we might ask questions like, well, considering the impacts on the environment, but also considering the benefits of, using cars and using electricity, right? What's the right balance of the two? Similarly, we'll also ask questions like, what's the efficient or sustainable rate of natural resource use? And then one of the questions I would always ask, and the analyses I tended to do at the agency, was things like, well, what are the benefits and costs of a proposed environmental policy? Ultimately, you want to recommend going forward with policies where the benefits outweigh the costs. In other words, will society be better off as a result of that policy? All right, so that's the kind of work that environmental economists do. And if you're pursuing a career in this path, and I'm saying environmental economist, but I think it also applies to anybody analyzing data in environmental fields. So if you're data analytics, public policy, but specializing in empirical analyses, I think all of this applies. So it's not just economists per se, right? And so you can find jobs in the government sector, where I was for the good chunk of the beginning of my career. And that could be at the state level. You can get positions at state and environmental health agencies, or health agencies more general. And you could also look in the federal government. There's lots of federal government positions for people pursuing public policy work or environmental economics, right? The Bureau of Land Management, Department of Energy, U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, the Environmental Protection Agency, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and even the Army Corps of Engineers, right? The Army Corps of Engineers goes out and designs dams and bridges and, physical human capital or infrastructure, but they have to do environmental impact analyses of all of these projects that they do. And they need economists to help inform those impact analyses. So there's a lot of potential careers in government. And, I left for some reasons, personal and otherwise, and professional, I guess, but it's a sweet gig in the government. In the federal government, you get great benefits. You're kind of, it's really hard to get fired, right? So you have some sense of security there. So it is a great career path for those that are interested in government service. You can also get positions in nonprofit sectors. And I'll give some examples later and this goes on both sides. There's nonprofit groups working for industry, and there's nonprofit groups working for the environmental advocacy groups, right? But I know a couple folks that have that are economists or public policy careers that are working in that sector. And then the private sector is a really big sector, working for consulting firms, and folks hire you to conduct economic analyses, to write reports, to synthesize and summarize the literature in a report for them. And these private consultants, they're hired by all sides, right? The environmental groups, the industry groups, and they're also hired by the government as well. And I'll talk about that more then. And then lastly, academia, right? You could be a professor like Dr. McAvoy or I, and teach the next generation of analysts, and also conduct some research that will hopefully inform policy development and stuff like that, at least indirectly, if not directly. Right, so there's lots of opportunities in virtually all aspects of the economy here. All right, so I'm going to focus on my experience with federal policy, and in particular with EPA regulations. And I kind of wanted to go through like the birth of an environmental regulation and kind of the life of that regulation. And I'm going to try to organize my whole talk around that. So first, for whatever reason, you have the need for some environmental regulation, right? Some environmental issue comes to light, and regulations aren't always the solution. A lot of times providing information to the public or to industry or some technical advice that might solve the issue, but sometimes you need, you can't always use the carrot, right? Sometimes you got to use the stick to solve an environmental issue. And so sometimes regulations are needed. And that's what I'll be focusing on today. So you have the need for environmental regulations emerges. Then you go through the regulatory development process. And I'll go into a little bit of detail on that then. And then after that, right, once you develop the regulation, it gets approved by all the policymakers, then that regulation is usually implemented. Usually it's phased in over a few-year period after it's actually signed and made official on paper, right? And you might think, well, that's the life of the regulation and then it's in effect. But actually, in reality, it's more of a cyclical process, right? How a regulation appears on paper might be very different than how how it actually works in reality, right? There might be unanticipated impacts or consequences or things that we didn't think about. So it's really more of a cyclical process where you have a regulation that's put in place. You realize, oh, maybe that's too stringent. Maybe it's not stringent enough. Maybe there's some loophole we didn't realize. So then you go back and revise that regulation. Or maybe you repeal the regulation and may or may not replace it with a new one, right? So it really is a cyclical process. And the nice thing is economists and analysts can weigh in on all stages of this regulatory development process, including after that regulation is actually implemented. There's still lots of room for improvement and for economists to kind of better inform the regulation to hopefully make it better. Right, so I'll go through each of these in a little bit more detail. First thing is the need for environmental regulation, right? So the need for environmental regulation, well, this can come to light in a bunch of different ways. For example, the more traditional way is Congress, right? Either from statutory instruction or more informal requests from Congress. An agency like the EPA might be asked to look into a specific environmental issue or revisit a regulation and see if a new regulation needs to be put in place or an existing regulation needs to be revised, right? And this is the traditional way that the need for a regulation comes about. All the regulations that any of the executive agencies like the EPA, NOAA, USDA, all of our regulations come under the authority of some law passed by Congress. It could be the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, right? Anything that these agencies do, if it's a regulation, has to come under the authority of an existing law from Congress, right? But we passed a lot of those environmental laws already. There hasn't been a lot of big sweeping environmental laws passed by Congress. So nowadays you see the courts are actually compelling agencies and requiring agencies to revisit or come up with new regulations. I was surprised to hear this when I first got to the EPA, but they're sued all the time on everything by both sides, right? You have industry groups suing them, saying this regulation's too stringent. You have environmental groups suing them, saying that same regulation isn't stringent enough. And so, there's constant court battles about everything that they do. And so, being sued by the states or industry or nonprofit groups, that also often leads to the need for an environmental regulation. And then it might just be executive order from the White House. You know, these days, given the difficulties of trying to get things through an often divided Congress, more and more we see unilateral executive orders coming from the White House, basically, I don't know if requiring is the right word, but strongly suggesting that a regulation be revisited or put in place, or basically just to visit some environmental issue, right? And in my last year or two at the EPA, we saw a lot of this under President Trump. Most often it was trying to repeal an environmental regulation. But this was also used heavily under the Obama administration too. So you see executive orders becoming a more and more common source, leading to some of these regulations we go into developing. All right. And then the one that should matter the most is public pressure, right? Public pressure and requests from the public could go directly to the EPA, right? And it could lead to the EPA saying, oh, that's an interesting environmental issue. We didn't realize that. Let's visit that and see if a regulation might be needed. But also public pressure, you know, indirectly can influence all of those other three, right? The public can be plaintiffs in a lawsuit. The public can contact their senators and representatives, or even try to, you know, appeal to the folks in the executive branch, right? So public, you know, ultimately kind of influences all of these, right? That's where it should all stem from, because we're the ones impacted by these regulations. So that's my kind of categorization of what could lead to the need for an environmental regulation, how that need emerges. And again, economic analyses can inform and motivate any of these actions leading to environmental regulations. So you could have economists in government and in academia writing studies and reports to help motivate Congress or the executive branch to look up a particular environmental issue and maybe do something about it. In the court cases, a lot of times those cases are supported by evidence from studies and expert testimony from economists in the private sector or nonprofit advocacy groups. They'll even hire academics sometimes to act as expert witnesses in these court cases. So you can help inform through that as well, right? So these analyses are conducted by economists. You know, they can also, you know, after that need for environmental regulation comes to light, the analyses could also be used to support or undermine the case after that initial call for a regulation. And that kind of gets into the second stage, the regulatory development process, right? So one key way economists try to inform regulatory development is through conducting benefit cost analyses. And so I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. But again, I just want to note, if anybody has any questions, feel free to interrupt as I go through, okay? All right, I just widened my window so I could see everybody, make sure I didn't put anybody out here. All right, so, and this is where I think I can give the most insight. You know, what is the regulatory development process? They actually have formal steps to take in conducting the review for the need for a potential regulation, and actually developing that regulation, kind of putting it on paper and saying what it's going to require, what you're going to have to do and when, and who's going to have to do it. And you know, sometimes they start this process and they might find out, well, maybe that regulation isn't a good idea, and then they'll just, you know, let it die and not pursue it anymore. And that's fine too. That's the purpose of the development process, to look at an environmental issue, see if regulation might help, and if so, then propose a potential regulation. Before I get into it too much, though, I want to just give a brief history of the use of benefit cost analysis, at least in US federal policy. And it really began with President Reagan back in 1981. He put an executive order in place that basically required benefit cost analysis be conducted for all major federal regulations, where he defined major as having an impact of $100 million a year or more in some fashion. And so all of those regulations were now formally required to have benefit cost analyses conducted, you know, to help either support or sometimes deter the case for or undermine the case for an environmental regulation. And since then, presidents on both sides of the aisle have really helped further institutionalize the role of economics in policy development. So at first, the policymakers and the natural scientists kind of looked at economic analysis as, oh man, this is another box I have to check. It's just busy work. It's not really doing anything, right? But now that's kind of changed, and economic analysis has become front and center in the policy development process. It's what the benefits and costs are of a regulation are some of the first things that the political folks will look at because of all these executive orders and further institutionalizing the role of economics in the policy development process. And, if you think about the beginning of environmental policies, in the 60s and 70s, where we first had the environmental movement, you didn't really need a benefit cost analysis because the initial environmental regulations put in place were really kind of no-brainers, right? We had rivers that were starting on fire in like Ohio because there was so much pollution in them. And we had people living on top of landfills with hazardous waste like at Love Canal, where they had high rates of birth defects and other chronic diseases coming up, right? So they were really obvious that the benefits were large and the costs were relatively small. And so you kind of didn't need benefit cost analysis then, at least not as formal as we think about it now. But these days, the environmental regulations are a lot more marginal, meaning that it's not always as clear cut whether the benefits are going to exceed the costs, right? And it really depends on sorry, I didn't mean to skip ahead there. And it really depends on your perspective. And unfortunately, these days, sometimes it also depends on your political affiliation. But, when the benefits and costs are so close and it's not a clear-cut answer about whether a regulation should definitely go forward or not, benefit cost analysis and analysis in general really is more and more important these days, right? It serves as an objective way to try to assess regulations, and it really attempts to systematically lay out the underlying assumptions in a transparent way, hopefully to try to facilitate more productive discussions and paths forward, right? People are sometimes starting at very often starting at very different starting points, but economic analysis, in being transparent and objective, tries to get them to the same starting point. They might still disagree, but at least it systematically lays things out for the discussion and to hopefully find a path forward in whether a regulation should or should not be implemented. So that was my kind of spiel on the importance of economic analysis and history of it in at least federal policymaking. And this applies to all agencies, right? Not just the Environmental Protection Agency and not just environmental policy. It applies to Department of Transportation, FAA, whoever. They all have to follow these rules when they're doing their regulations. They have to do these benefit cost analyses. So the role of an economist is becoming more and more important. And of course, take that with a grain of salt. I'm an economist. I'm a little biased, but I think others would agree with that generalization. So now I want to get into the regulatory development process, now that we kind of had that brief history. So, we talked about why the role of why the need for a possible regulation comes about. So now you got to figure out, well, how do you actually develop that regulation? So the first thing is you'll have a lead office within the EPA, such as the Office of Air or Office of Water, right? It depends what the environmental issue is. But they'll be kind of the lead office to kind of oversee the regulatory development process. And then they're going to form a work group. And that work group is an interdisciplinary group of experts. It includes natural scientists, sociologists, economists, lawyers. There's people that work specifically on enforcement and compliance issues. And there's people with just kind of a general public policy background that help make sure that everybody follows the appropriate protocols and things like that. And so this interdisciplinary group gets together, they start discussing, and they start developing the rule package. And the rule package is basically a document of hundreds, often thousands of pages long. And in their rule package, they're required to come up with 3 regulatory options, right? And technically it's actually 4 options. You always have the status quo option, which is do nothing. The regulation might not be needed. But then they're supposed to have 3 regulatory options, where one regulatory option is kind of the work group's preferred option. And then they're also required to have a more stringent and presumably more costly option, as well as a less stringent and presumably less costly option. And the reason they kind of lay out three regulatory options is to give decision makers or the policy makers kind of a menu of options to choose from, so they can look at the benefits and costs of each of those options, as well as the actual detail behind the options, and kind of gives them a little bit more of a continuous menu to choose from, right? Instead of just saying you have this or nothing, they have a couple options to pick from, right? And so this rule package, it includes the legal text detailing the regulation, and also a lot of supporting analyses. And one of the most important supporting analyses there is the benefit cost analysis of the regulation, where it lays out for each option, here is the benefits, here's the costs, and here are the net benefits. And ideally, you'd want to recommend the regulatory option that yields the highest net benefits. That's going to give society the most gain in welfare. So government economists are the ones kind of leading the development of the benefit cost analysis. And I was actually surprised to learn that when actually conducting these analyses, unless it's like a really relevant, high level, in the public eye type of issue, often we're hiring private contractors to conduct a lot of the benefit cost analysis. So the government economists will kind of lay out the framework and what needs to be covered, but these analyses take a lot of work, years to develop, and entail hundreds of pages of analysis, data gathering, right? And so it's a lot of work, and often we need help. And so private contractors are often hired and do a lot of the actual kind of on the ground analysis work for the benefit cost analysis. So there's a huge role there for future analysts in terms of a career. And then, economists in academia, nonprofit advocacy groups, they'll also have a role, which I'll get to in a minute. So the work group develops their proposed rule options. They then go to a stage that we call option selection. So option selection is basically the lead office calls the political leaders from all of the other offices. So if I was the lead, we call them assistant administrators. If I was the lead political appointee for the Office of Air, and I wanted to go forward with the regulation on air quality, well then after I developed that regulation, I'd call in the political appointee from the Office of Water, and I'd call in the political appointee from the Office of Land and Emergency Management, and all the other offices. There's 4 or 5 of them. And they'd all get together. Their experts would review the rule package, and they give a recommendation to their political appointee. And basically, this acts as a way for everybody across the agency to get on the same page and decide whether to go forward and propose this regulation to folks outside of the agency. And so that kind of leads to the next step. If they all agree on the regulatory package and the preferred regulatory option, then that rule package goes outside the agency. It goes over to the Office of Management and Budget, which is a building right next to the White House. And the Office of Management and Budget then reviews the rule package. They might give suggestions. And they act as kind of a mediator to get the entire federal government on the same page. OMB works with all the government agencies. They want to make sure that the economic analyses are consistent, that other agencies won't have big issues with the proposed regulation, right? At the Environmental Protection Agency, for example, the Department of Agriculture would often have issues with the regulations we were proposing because it might affect their stakeholders in a certain way. So OMB kind of acts like a mediator to help kind of facilitate agreement across the entire federal government. At the same time, we also have this public comment period where academics or nonprofit advocacy groups can go in and log on. I think it was regs.gov. I forget the exact website, but I can give it to you. But even you and I, as private citizens, can go on and provide public comment on the rule and on the rule package, right? Anybody can go and provide public comment. And sometimes people working as private contractors will be hired by industry and environmental groups to conduct reports and submit those reports as part of the public comment, right? So there's a lot of interaction and roles for future analysts to inform environmental policy development through that public comment. even if you're not directly working for the government or indirectly as a contractor working for the government. All right, so after that OMB, that's all the proposed rule package. Then we have to take all those comments from OMB, all of those comments from the public, and we have to review, and in some, ideally we'd incorporate them, but some of the comments are really out there. Sometimes the comments, you might just respond to them, but not explicitly incorporate them into the analysis. We might just, but we still have to write up a response document saying like, okay, yeah, that's a good comment, but we're not gonna account for that because of X, Y, and Z. And so we have to, it takes a lot of work. We also hire private contractors sometimes to help respond to the public comments. I worked on a regulation having to do with improving water quality across the US, and there was hundreds of thousands of comments there. They actually had to get a private contractor who specializes in word recognition software, which kind of scans through and summarizes the comments for us, because it would have taken years and years and years to actually read every single comment that was submitted on that regulation. But in any case, some of the public comments and stuff those are good comments, and we get good feedback. And so then we would revise the rule package and then start developing that final rule package. And so you go through the exact same process there, where again, that work group, that interdisciplinary group, they revise the rule. And then once they're happy with it, it goes to the EPA, the entire agency more broadly. They again have that option selection meeting. And then again, it's gonna go back to OMB for a second round and a public comment and a second round of OMB review. Sometimes, ideally the stylized kind of template is you go through this twice and it either dies after that or the regulation ends up being implemented. But in practice, I often saw these steps kind of iterate multiple times because it's really hard to get everybody happy because everybody has different objectives, right? But eventually, if they decide to pursue the environmental regulation, then that final rule is kind of signed and implemented within the next few years. So that's kind of the general life cycle of the whole regulatory development process. But again, at each of these stages, economists weigh in and analysts weigh in, right? In the blue squares, you're mostly private contractors and government employees weighing in on the development process. In the green squares, you could be working in the private industry, you could be working in academia, you could be working for nonprofit groups, but you'll be weighing in during the public comment period. All right, so lots of ways that you can help in the development of a rule. All right, so these are my political folks, these silhouettes here, very shadowy government, but the benefits and costs are just one thing that these folks have to account for, right? As economists, we're providing objective information to the decision makers, but I wouldn't actually be making the decisions. I might have a recommendation based on which option might yield the highest net benefits, but I'm not making the recommendation. I'm just providing that objective information to the policymakers. And then someone well above my pay grade would actually be making these decisions based on that information. But they also have a lot of other information too that they have to account for, right? They don't care just about the benefits and costs. They have to care about what their legal experts are telling them about statutory instruction. They have to care about institutional and technical feasibility, as well as the enforceability of a regulation, right? Something could look great on paper. My benefit cost analysis would say it has really high net benefits, but if you can't actually enforce that regulation in reality, then what's the point, right? And so this is important information that they have to account for also, as well as political concerns. Unfortunately, that comes into play a lot, and also ethical concerns, right? And even though economists traditionally will weigh in on the benefits and costs, the benefit cost analyses, more and more you have economists weighing in on other types of analyses. There's some that's based their whole career off of doing analyses of enforceability and how to better identify people that are cheating the regulation, or how to make the enforceability of a regulation more cost effective. And these days, equity issues and ethical concerns are more and more important, and you see economists more and more weighing in on distributional or equity analyses, right? Not just saying, well, what's the best for society overall, but what's the distribution of benefits and costs across different subpopulations, right? And so, analysts have more, because there's so many concerns, and because it's not always a clear-cut answer about whether a regulation is important or not. Anybody with any type of analysis experience and ability to work with data and bring in theory like economic theory, there's a big role there to help inform decision making and hopefully make society better off as a result of that, right? So that kind of brings me to the next thing, right? After the decision makers have all of their information, then they'll get into the actual implementation of the regulation. So even after a regulation has been developed and implemented and it's now in effect, economists and other analysts can still play a key role in conducting what we call ex post analyses, right? Ex post analyses are just when you're kind of weighing in after the fact. After the regulation is implemented, you're looking at the impacts of the regulation now on the ground. So ex post, or after the fact. And you might ask questions in an ex post analysis like, was the regulation more costly than we initially estimated? Did the regulation actually yield the expected magnitude of benefits we originally estimated? Can something be done differently to lower the costs or maybe increase the benefits of that regulation? Were there any unintended consequences, or did the regulation have the effect that we initially intended, right? And that's an important one. Private industry is really clever, and it's motivated by profit maximization, right? And so are people like you and me. If a regulation affects us, that's fine. But we want to maximize our utility or make ourselves and our family as well off as possible. And we want to minimize the costs of us being able to do that, right? And so even if we're well-intentioned, we might find ways around a regulation, and there might be unanticipated consequences or unanticipated impacts that they didn't initially account for when they were developing the policy. I tried to think of two examples. One I thought of was the New Source Performance Review Program, which basically was air pollution regulations for stationary sources like power plants. This is a little bit dated of a regulation, but it was requiring cleaner technology on factories. So I always think of like, any factory that has a big smokestack, right? It was requiring cleaner technologies. And in an attempt to be more cost effective, they were only requiring these new technologies on new facilities. Basically, the idea was that cleaner abatement technologies could be put in place as they're constructing a new facility, but it's really expensive to retrofit an old and existing facility. And so this seemed like a good idea at the time, that they could actually get cleaner air, reduce air pollution, and also do it in a relatively cheap way. But being profit maximizers, the folks in industry ended up keeping these older facilities in life longer to avoid those expensive technology updates. So it actually prolonged the life of the older facilities and the more polluting facilities. And so it had an impact that was counter to the initial objective of the rule. And that was something they didn't anticipate. Now in hindsight, it seems like, oh yeah, that was stupid. We should have thought that through. But at the time, who can blame them? It's always 20/20 in hindsight, right? But that's why these ex post analyses are really useful. Another example is the CAFE standards, which were the US standards requiring increased fuel efficiency for cars, right? Trying to set a fleet-wide average on how many miles per gallon new cars could get. But this had a type of rebound effect, because as people were able to drive more with less gasoline, or as people were able to drive farther with less gasoline, that also meant people were meant to drive more. And so, the main reason for these CAFE standards were energy independence, not necessarily air pollution, but it did have this unintended rebound effect on air pollution, because people could be driving more because it's now cheaper to drive. It also had the impact of, it also had a counter impact in the sense that, if you're requiring companies to make more fuel efficient cars, well, the cheapest way to make a car more fuel efficient is to make the car lighter, right? Use less dense and unfortunately less safe materials. And so that's what industry did. But because those lighter cars were less safe, consumers like you and I started buying SUVs and trucks. And so these heavier and safer cars, they're more fuel efficient, they're safer, but they're less fuel efficient, right? So they're larger. So again, it had this impact that kind of went counter to the original objective of the rule. And so that's where these ex post analyses can be really useful. So that's another way that you can weigh into the regulatory development process, or maybe the next round of regulatory development, right? These ex post analyses can sometimes highlight the need to go back and revise the regulations.
So I know you said the regulatory development process can take years. Is there anything is that kind of standard for all regulations, or are there some that take, a shorter amount of time than others? I guess I'm just trying to ballpark in my head. I'm seeing all these things that go into the process, but is it 2 years? Is it 4 years and then you revisit it?
So yeah, I think it totally depends. I think there's a lot of variation. When I first got to EPA, I met an economist. It was really disheartening. I met an economist that was working there for 30 years. And, I was my second day there, just out of grad school, all bright-eyed, ready to, save the world. And I was like, so how many environmental regulations have you seen through? And he looked at me and he goes, none. So I mean, it's an issue, right? And the thing is, it's not that it was a bad idea, but the political winds are shifting every 4 or 8 years, right? And so, if you have a lot of political capital, if the policymakers want to see something happen, or the public is really pushing to see something happen, then you can have a push. And I saw some regulations, to their credit, under the Trump administration, they had some repeals of regulations, and we have to go through that same right to repeal regulation. It's the same as developing a new regulation. And I saw at least 1 or 2 go through that whole process in about 2 years. So it can happen quick if the political willpower and the public pressure is behind it. But I also saw some that, they were ongoing when I got there, and they were still ongoing when I didn't get there. And sometimes they might be ongoing, but really that means they're just kind of sitting on the vine, dying, because there's no pressure behind them. But, the folks that are really thinking long-term are thinking, well, the next administration might be interested in that. Someone's going to come in eventually and be interested in it again. So they kind of just say, I'm putting it on the shelf, but it's there when the public or the political folks are ready to pursue it again. So, it totally varies. I'd say anywhere from 2 to years to decades. So I always get that question. Hopefully that provides some insight.
Yeah, so I was actually going to ask, isn't there a way to also expedite the process if it's an emergency and take it straight to the president, or is that false information?
So, I mean, the president can order executive orders. That's kind of the discussion right now in the media and in politics. How much bite do executive orders actually have? How much can they actually do? But yeah, I mean, it might not go through a formal regulatory development process if there was an emergency. But also it depends on the emergency, because some regulations and laws already have in place the infrastructure for doing an action that's not formally a regulation, but it's kind of like a regulation for those emergency situations. So yeah, you might not always have to go through this process if it already kind of is funneled through an existing regulation. Like the cleanup of, like when we had the coal ash levees or whatever they're called break here in North Carolina, right? That was a huge emergency, but all that cleanup happened under existing regulations. It's not like they had to go through a multi-year process for that. Yeah, good question.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question too. So when someone, and I can't remember specifically what it was, but when Obama was president, he signed something about regulating emissions. I think it was cars, but then also some energy producers. And so when something like that happens, I don't know if it was an executive order, but is that a EPA regulation that's already gone through this whole process and then the president is just signing it? Or is he signing this intention and then there's this regulatory process that has to be done? So when a president is, I know when they're signing an executive order, it doesn't really hold a lot of, or it can easily not hold a lot of weight and be just overturned the next cycle. But for something that like gains a lot more momentum on like a president's platform and is these regulations, because now they're like in place because the Trump administration was trying to take them away from like car emissions and California was fighting that back. How does the EPA play into creating their standards for emissions and then it getting like pushed back and forth and back and forth? Does that question make sense?
Sort of. Let me try to break it down, and if I get off track, correct me. So first, I think the most often thing I saw with executive orders is the executive orders were signed basically mandating the agencies to look into an issue and come up with a regulation or revisit an existing regulation. So they were kind of the way to spark the flame to pursue it, okay? And as far as building it in, you know, the hope is that regulations won't be overturned in the future, but obviously that happens because conditions change, administrations change. I think, you know, if I had to kind of rate things, I think executive orders are the most easily overturned from administration to administration. Regulations are on the book and legal, and so they're a little bit more permanent. But the only thing that's like somewhat guaranteed to be permanent, not guaranteed, but the most permanent is laws. If Congress really wanted something to stay on the books no matter what, they have to get together and pass laws to keep it kind of as official as possible. You know, and even that can be revisited, but that's a lot tougher to do. Executive orders, the next administration can just go like that and, you know, disregard all of them. But regulations are at least on the books and they have to go through some of these processes. As far as trying to account for that in the analyses, you know, we try to, and government policy, well, maybe not the political folks per se, but the analysts, the on the ground workers, the ones that are just government employed, full-time career employees, you know, they're really good at separating out despite what people say, they're really good at separating out their underlying political beliefs and stuff like that. They're really looking at the long-term goals, and they honestly, at least in my experience, I've seen try to keep their eye on that long-term ball and not be dissuaded by the political winds. And the idea is that by looking at the horizon, yeah, things might sway a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right, but in the long run, hopefully it balances out and gets it to the place where everybody's going to be better off. That might be overly optimistic, but that's really what I saw while I was there from the career folks. So I don't know if that answers your question, Maddie, or.
Kind of, I don't really know exactly what the question was, just like clear on the process. So if something goes through Congress and it becomes a law, it's going to stick a lot more, but the EPA is really looking at regulations from both executive orders and Congress. Like they can be getting direction from both sides, correct?
Yeah. I mean, it's an executive agency, so technically we work directly under the president. But anything, even the executive orders, they still have to, if it's going to require regulation, it has to come under the authority of an existing law. So it's not like the president can just say, do this. It has to at least fall under the authority of a law. But they're trying to appease both branches of government, I guess. But we most directly, we fall under the executive branch. So I guess that holds a little bit more weight in some ways. I don't know if that answers the question or
Yeah,
not.
that does. Thanks.
Okay. So let's see. Dave, feel free to stop me if I start going over on time here. But I only have one or two more slides. Any other questions? That was a good exchange. No? All right, just interrupt if you do. So the last thing I wanted to talk about then, let's see, I talked about the regulation being implemented. Let's see. So now I kind of just wanted to go through, I don't know what everybody's level of degree here is. I think we have a few people pursuing a master's and a few pursuing a bachelor's, I'm guessing. But I want to go through, where you might fit in these different roles for economists, right? And so I tried to, or what you might be doing, I guess. And so I tried to kind of, there's a lot of overlap here, but I tried to categorize the type of work you'd be doing day to day if you were an analyst, either an economist or a statistician, whatever, doing some type of analytical work, or a public policy person, right? And so some of the work you might be doing is just assisting with studies, might be conducting literature reviews, searching and compiling data, maybe doing some basic statistical or theoretical analyses. Some other work folks might be doing is conducting or assisting with the studies, where you might be using existing methodologies, writing up reports, or even critiquing others' reports. And lastly, you might also be designing and conducting studies to actually designing the studies, right? Getting funding, motivating people to say, this is why this study is interesting, leading the projects, designing them, maybe even developing the next frontier of methodologies, right? And so this is kind of a spectrum of tasks that you might be doing in your everyday life as an analyst. And then I tried to divide it up, this is just kind of my personal insight, but I try to divide up, where you'd be with different degree levels in that spectrum. So if you had a bachelor's degree, at least starting out your career, you'd probably be more on the end of assisting with existing studies, doing lit reviews, compiling data, doing some basic analysis, stuff like that. That doesn't mean that's all you're going to be doing, right? It depends, and that's why I kind of tried to make it like a continuum with this graphic. That's what I'm trying to represent. But chances are, at least when you start, you're going to be more on the left side of the tasks here, right? But as you get more and more experience, you could move more to the right side, or kind of get all of these different tasks. And I've met folks with a bachelor's or a master's degree that have, instead of pursuing higher level education, they just worked in the field for 20 or 30 years and ended up being at the same level in the end. So, I mean, this isn't a firm path. I'm just trying to give you a sense of, when you get out of school, this is the type of work you might be doing as an analyst if you're working on policy.
So,
With a master's degree, I'm guessing you'd probably be a little bit more in the center here in terms of where a lot of your work might be. And then, a PhD, you'd probably be more on the right end of the spectrum. And, maybe this graphic's not totally representative, because I can say that I'm still doing all of these things every day. But it kind of gives you a relative sense. You're probably not going to be leading and designing new projects with just a bachelor's degree, at least to start. But hopefully this helps kind of gauge and help you think about the trade-offs of, getting a higher degree versus, getting out in the field and starting to, save the world and get some experience right off the bat. Okay.
So, quick question on schools. How much weight would you put on the different grad schools? Do you think it really matters where you go to get your master's, or as long as you get your master's, do you think you'd be fine?
In my personal opinion, I think the school can matter, especially if you want to go into academia. Unfortunately, the name of the school matters a lot sometimes. Maybe fortunately, maybe unfortunately, I don't know. But but if you want to go into like government or the private sector, I think it matters. But I think the type of program also matters. So it depends on what you want to pursue. These days, one thing folks always said at the EPA was we have a lot of generalists, a lot of people that know a whole lot, or know a little bit, but know a little bit about a whole lot. And you need those types of people there, right? Because they can kind of see the bigger picture, bring all the pieces together. But they had a demand or a shortage of people with the technical expertise that maybe know a lot, but only about a very specific topic. And so I think, holding what university you go to constant, the type of degree might matter depending on what you wanted to pursue. Otherwise, specific names don't matter per se, but you can kind of have your own, it's a signal. The name is just a signal and it's one signal, right, of the quality of and your skill level, right? But you can have other things besides just the name of the university provide signals as well. So it's not the only thing that folks are looking at.
I think one thing that a lot of students don't necessarily know is for graduate school, for economists, especially going on to a PhD, but a master's as well, is that you can find programs where you have support, financial support, both for tuition and a stipend for either your graduate research assistant or teacher, where, this is different from other graduate programs, where for most of us who went to a PhD, we didn't pay for that degree in the traditional sense. You give up your years of time that you could be working in the job market, but you have a job, you have a living wage, and someone's paying your tuition. Of course, that's much different from an MBA and a lot of other grad programs. And so that's the support that you get can differ from universities and from programs. And so I think that's a big thing to keep in mind. You may get into a very highly ranked school, but you might not have the support you would with a smaller program. You may have more professor-student interaction at a smaller program. So I think you can kind of make do, but the school does, matter in those traditional senses. Like, if you graduate from a highly ranked program, it can be helpful. So
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
All right, thanks, Dave. We got like 1 or 2 minutes left. Any other questions, or I can wrap up then? All right, so I tried to make the similar graphic kind of showing where you could work with different levels of degrees. And basically, all of the sectors are open. I think the only one it really matters if you're interested in working as a researcher for like one of the interdisciplinary research centers at a university, or being a faculty member. There, it's a lot tougher if you don't have a doctorate. It's not out of the question though. So that's what this graphic's meant to kind of illustrate. But otherwise, I've seen people with all different degree levels working in all the different sectors. So it's definitely possible there. So that's all I was trying to say with that little graphic there. And then this last bit, I don't know if the slides are going to be available, or maybe y'all can take a screenshot or email me after this, but I just wanted to show some potential links on where you can look for jobs, permanent positions, or even temporary internships. The two I wanted to draw folks' attention to the most are usajobs.gov. If you're interested in working for the federal government, that's where every single opening in the federal government is required to advertise on usajobs.gov. It's not the most user-friendly search engine, but that's a very comprehensive place to go. And then also, agencies are increasingly using this program through ORISE for more temporary positions, like internships while you're a student, or internships after you're a graduate. And I had interns working for me at EPA who were at a bachelor's degree. They were still pursuing their bachelor's degree. We had some master's students who recently finished up or were continuing their master's. And so you can get anything from a summer internship there to up to a two-year appointment. You're not officially a government employee, but you're working right next to government employees. So that's a great program. The AAAS fellowships, I haven't seen as much. I don't know about as much detail there, but that's another program to potentially look into. And then I also provided some lists of nonprofit groups where I know economists working for them, as well as some of the private companies that I worked with while I was at EPA. Not a comprehensive list by any means, but at least gives you a sense if you wanted to start looking around and seeing what might be out. So I can share that list if folks didn't get a chance, or just email me. Here's my email. I don't know if we have any more time, but I'm happy to take questions offline or anything like that. But thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Yeah, thank you again, Dr. Guignet.
No problem. Yeah.
Very informative.
Is someone kicking us out of this Zoom room now? Is that how it works?
I'm just going to stay on all day.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I don't know. I have no idea.
Okay. Well, yeah. Well, thanks for coming, Zoe. I appreciate it. And
Yeah,
Dave,
of course. I was gonna ask, because I had to. is there a general consensus on climate change when you were working at the EPA?
Among the career folks, I think generally
Yes, like
speaking,
within the industry, like the people that you were directly interacting with.
well, I wasn't really working on climate change stuff at all, or air pollution stuff really.
Right.
But I think, you know, that whether they're a public policy person or a social scientist or a natural scientist, I think generally the career folks agreed, at least what I saw. I mean, I was working at headquarters in DC, which tends to have more liberal thinking people in terms of background. So, I mean, if you went to some of the other offices in other parts of the country, they might have different opinions. I'm not sure. But I think generally among career folks, they recognize that the science is at least suggesting well, the science is definitely suggesting climate change, and it seems that a high probability that at least some of it's human caused. But with the new administration, and you know, when I was working under the Obama administration, they passed the Clean Power Plan, which was the first plan to regulate greenhouse gases. At least that was the main, at least for carbon, I think. And, you know, I had concerns about that plan. It wasn't necessarily the most cost-effective way to do it. As an economist, I'd rather see market incentive approaches, I think. But it was still, you know, from the environmentalist in me wants to say, yeah, it's a good idea. And I think most people thought that. But the climate change branch was dissolved as soon as the new administration came in. So, I mean, if you look at the leadership of the EPA, who represent the agency, then the agency, I would say there wasn't a consensus, or a consensus in the other way, right? Because we have to serve at the pleasure of the leadership. And so there it kind of swayed the other way. So I don't know if that answers your
Nope. Thanks for humoring it. I appreciate it. Good to see you, Dr. McAvoy.
You too,
Have
Zoe.
a great day. Bye.
Let's see it.
See you, everyone.